Growing up, the difference between my brother Jake and me was painfully obvious. Jake was the golden child, and I was always just there. It didn't matter what I did, no accomplishment of mine could hold a candle to Jake's charm, charisma, and the effortless way he seemed to sail through life. Where I had to grind my way through school, part-time jobs, and everything in between, Jake was gifted opportunities left and right. My parents adored him, spoiling him with new cars, lavish vacations, and indulging his every whim while I was expected to handle my own struggles. I figured things would change once we grew older. I thought maybe adulthood would even the playing field, that our parents would see the hard work I'd put in, recognize the grind I had endured. But I was wrong. If anything, Jake only doubled down on his arrogance. His carefree lifestyle didn't falter. Even as I built a stable career, a marriage, and a home, Jake kept living like nothing he did had consequences, because in our family, that's exactly how it was. It was frustrating to say the least, but I tried to distance myself from that resentment. I focused on my marriage to Emily, the woman I thought I'd spend the rest of my life with. For a while, we were happy, but then things started to unravel in the most shocking way possible. I found out that Jake had been sleeping with my wife. At first, it didn't even feel real. I remember staring at the messages I found on Emily's phone, feeling like I'd been punched in the gut. My mind couldn't fully process what I was reading, that the woman I had shared my life with, the person I trusted above all, had been cheating on me with Jake, my own brother. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt. It was the sheer arrogance that Jake showed after I confronted him. "Look, man, it's not that big of a deal," he said, flashing that same smirk he'd used since we were kids. "You and Emily were having issues anyway, right? I figured it wouldn't be a huge thing." The audacity, the absolute nerve of him to downplay the situation, as if this was just another careless mistake that would be easily forgiven. He believed, no, he knew, that our parents would sweep this under the rug, just like they had done with every other mistake he made. Jake had always been immune to consequences, protected by the pedestal our parents had placed him on. But this time it was different. This wasn't just Jake messing up again. He hadn't just crossed a line. He had obliterated it. He destroyed my marriage and shattered the last remnants of respect I had for him. And this time, there was no going back. I wasn't going to stand by and let him walk away from this like nothing had happened. This was the last straw, the point of no return. After the initial shock wore off, the rage set in. For days, I walked around in a daze, trying to figure out how my life had come to this. My wife, Emily, tried to apologize, but I couldn't even look at her. The betrayal was too deep, and no amount of apologies could fix what she had broken. I filed for divorce within a week, cutting her off completely. Jake, on the other hand, didn't even have the decency to face me. For a while, I wasn't sure if I was more angry at Jake or myself. Angry that I had let this golden child dynamic go on for so long. Angry that I hadn't stood up for myself earlier. Angry that I had let it reach the point where Jake thought he could get away with something this unforgivable. When I confronted him, I expected him to at least show some remorse. But that wasn't Jake's style. He brushed it off as though it was just another mess I'd have to deal with. "Look, man, it's not like I wanted to hurt you," he said, leaning back in his chair like we were talking about something trivial. "It just happened. I didn't think it was that serious." "Not that serious? You slept with my wife." I yelled, the rage bubbling to the surface. "Yeah, and I said I'm sorry, but come on, you and Emily were already having issues, right?" Jake shrugged. I figured it wouldn't matter in the long run. That was the moment I realized Jake didn't get it. He had never faced consequences for anything in his life, so why would this be any different? He honestly believed that because he was the favorite son, I'd just let this go like every other time he had crossed a line. But this time I was done. The breaking point wasn't just about the affair. It was about everything that had built up over the years. The bullying, the mockery, the way he tormented me while our parents looked the other way. Jake had spent years being cruel, and I had spent years swallowing my pride, thinking one day it would get better. It hadn't. And it never would. I could feel the walls closing in, suffocating me under the weight of all these years of resentment. I was done with pretending things were fine. I was done being the one who had to tolerate everything because Jake had been labeled the golden child. This time, there were going to be consequences, and he wasn't going to talk his way out of it. "I'm done, Jake. Done letting you walk all over me. You can't charm your way out of this one." He looked taken aback for a second, but then shrugged it off, still too arrogant to understand. That moment, I realized he'd never change. This wasn't just another mistake to him. It was who he was, and I wasn't going to let him have that power over me anymore. When I broke the news to my parents, I expected the usual excuses, rationalizations, and ultimately, forgiveness for Jake. But this time, I was in for a surprise. As I sat across from them in their living room, recounting what had happened, my mother's face fell, and her eyes filled with a pain I had never seen before. "I can't believe he would do something like this," she murmured, almost as if speaking to herself. She repeated it over and over, as if saying it enough times would make the betrayal disappear. My dad, usually the more silent and stoic of the two, stared at the ground for a long time before looking up at me. There was no anger in his eyes, just a quiet resignation. "This is the last straw," he said. His voice was firm, final. That one sentence changed everything. For years, Jake had been the center of their world, the one they defended no matter how badly he messed up. But this time, not even they could find a way to shield him. My dad, who had spent years silently allowing Jake to get away with everything, was now resolute. They were done. Jake had always lived off our parents' generosity, letting them fund his careless, reckless lifestyle. He never worked a serious job, never had to face real consequences, because he always knew Mom and Dad would bail him out. But not this time. They cut him off financially. No more support, no more handouts. Jake was about to face the world without the safety net he'd relied on his entire life. The part that shocked me most wasn't their decision to cut him off. It was what they did next. They told me they were revising their will. Jake, once the obvious heir to their estate, was being cut out entirely. Instead, they were making me the sole heir to everything. $2 million that had once been promised to both of us was now mine alone. I hadn't asked for this, hadn't even thought about it. To me, it wasn't about the money. But this gesture, in its own way, was their way of acknowledging that they had failed me for years. That they had enabled Jake's behavior while neglecting me. When Jake found out, all hell broke loose. He called me, furious, his voice trembling with rage. "You've turned them against me," he screamed. "This is all your fault. You've ruined my life." I stayed silent, letting him vent, because I knew this wasn't about me. It was about him finally facing the consequences of his own actions. But Jake wasn't used to that. In his world, there had always been someone to clean up his messes, to shield him from the fallout. Now, for the first time, there was no one left to save him. "They're cutting me off? You're getting everything? This is a joke, right? I'm the one who always took care of them." His words were laced with disbelief. "No, Jake. This is real," I replied calmly, though inside, I was still processing it all myself. "They're done with you, and so am I." For the first time in his life, Jake wasn't the favorite anymore. And the golden boy was about to find out what life was like without the golden glow that had always protected him. Weeks had gone by since my parents had cut Jake off, and his golden boy life had unraveled quicker than even I expected. Without their financial support, he was floundering. Jake had never learned how to fend for himself, never held down a real job, never had to face the consequences of his actions. Now he was broke, unemployed, and desperate. I had heard through the grapevine that he had tried to get back with Emily, but even she had turned her back on him after our divorce. It was a mess of his own making, and now he was reaching out to anyone who might listen, including me. At first, it was easy to ignore him. His texts were vague apologies, barely skimming the surface of the damage he had caused. I wasn't interested in reading his half-hearted attempts at mending things. Then the calls started, voicemail after voicemail, each more pleading than the last, asking me to meet him, to talk, to hear his side of the story. The irony was almost laughable. After years of him treating me like the inferior brother, Jake was now begging for a chance to explain himself. I stayed firm. I wasn't going to let him weasel his way back into my life. But one night, as I was heading out, I found him standing at my apartment door. He had tracked me down. I barely recognized the person standing in front of me. Gone was the cocky, arrogant brother I had grown up with. In his place was someone disheveled, gaunt, and utterly defeated. "Please, man, just hear me out," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. There was no swagger left, no pretense. I didn't slam the door in his face, though part of me wanted to. Instead, I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. "What do you want, Jake?" "I'm sorry," he blurted out, the words rushing out of him like a dam had broken. "I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. And I know I don't deserve another chance. But I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I didn't think it through. I didn't think everyone would turn their backs on me." "You didn't think?" I echoed, my voice full of disdain. "No, Jake, that's the problem. You never think. You never had to." Jake's eyes welled up with tears, and for the briefest moment, I felt a flicker of pity. But it was fleeting. He had dug his own grave, and now he was stuck in it. I've lost everything, Jake continued, his voice trembling. Emily, Mom and Dad, even you. I don't have anyone left. I want to make things right. I don't know how, but I'll do anything. Please, just help me. I stood there, staring at him, trying to make sense of the emotions swirling inside me. For years, Jake had made my life hell. The mocking, the constant belittling, the way he had always treated me like an afterthought, someone to be trampled on. And now, here he was practically on his knees, asking for my forgiveness, asking for my help. But I wasn't ready to forgive him, not after everything he had done. Make things right? I repeated, shaking my head. Jake, there's no making this right. You didn't just cross a line, you shattered it. You destroyed my marriage. You betrayed me. You tore our family apart. Jake looked down, his shoulders slumping. I know, and I'll never forgive myself for it. But I need you. Please, I can't do this on my own. I clenched my jaw, the anger simmering just beneath the surface. For so long, I had been the one in Jake's shadow, the one who had to pick up the pieces after his messes. I wasn't going to do it again. I can't help you, Jake, I said, my voice cold but firm. You've always had someone to bail you out. Not this time. Jake's face crumpled, and for the first time in our lives, he looked truly broken. But I wasn't going to be the one to put him back together. He had to live with the consequences of his actions. I turned and walked back inside, closing the door behind me, leaving Jake to stand alone in the hallway. There would be no second chances. Not this time. Jake's pleas didn't stop after that night. He texted, called, even left a couple of voice messages that I deleted without listening to. He still didn't get it. The damage was done, and no amount of groveling was going to erase what he had done. For so long, he lived in this bubble where everything just fell into place for him, where no mistake was ever too big because someone was always there to clean it up. But now, he was alone, and it was finally sinking in. One night, after ignoring yet another call from Jake, I sat down and thought about everything. Our childhood, the endless comparison, the favoritism, all the moments where I was pushed to the sidelines while Jake was lifted up. It wasn't just about him sleeping with Emily. It was about years of resentment, years of being overlooked, years of always coming second. The betrayal had just been the final straw. The next day, Jake showed up at my door again. I didn't want to talk to him, but something in his eyes made me listen, at least for a few minutes. Please, man. I know I messed up. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm trying. I really am, he said, desperation clinging to every word. I let him talk, but I could feel my patience thinning. Jake had always been good at saying what people wanted to hear. But this wasn't about what I wanted to hear. This was about him facing reality, and I wasn't going to let him avoid that any longer. You think saying sorry is enough? I asked, crossing my arms. You destroyed my marriage, Jake. You lied to me. You slept with Emily, and now you think an apology is going to fix this? Jake's face twisted in guilt. I'm not asking you to forget. I want a chance to start over. I'll do whatever it takes. I sighed, feeling the weight of years of frustration bearing down on me. Jake, this isn't just about the affair. It's about everything. You spent your whole life getting away with things because you knew someone would bail you out. But you can't keep doing that. Not anymore. Jake opened his mouth to speak, but I cut him off. I can't help you. Not this time. You've burned too many bridges, and this is what you did to me and to our family. There's no coming back from that. He looked at me like he didn't believe what I was saying. For years, I'd let things slide, always try to be the bigger person, always hoping Jake would grow up. But this was the end of the line. I don't hate you, I said after a long pause. But I'm done with you. You need to fix your own life. I can't save you this time. Jake's shoulders slumped. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, as if waiting for me to change my mind. But I didn't. I couldn't. Eventually, he nodded, the realization sinking in. I get it, he mumbled, his voice barely audible. I'm sorry, man. For everything. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his footsteps heavy as he left my apartment for the last time. I stood there, watching him go, feeling a strange sense of relief wash over me. It was done. Jake was gone. And for the first time in my life, I felt free from the shadow he had cast over me. In the weeks that followed, I found myself in unfamiliar territory. Peace. The divorce papers were signed, and Emily was officially out of my life. It wasn't easy, but there was a sense of closure. My anger toward her had faded into indifference. Jake, too, was cut off, and though there were occasional texts or attempts to reconnect, I ignored them. I was done with the toxic cycle we'd been trapped in for years. My parents, surprisingly, took steps to mend our relationship. While they had always favored Jake, the betrayal forced them to reevaluate everything. For the first time, they acknowledged how their treatment of me over the years had played a role in the family dynamic. It wasn't a perfect resolution, and I'd be lying if I said there weren't still lingering feelings of resentment. But the fact that they recognized the damage they'd caused, well, it meant something. We had more honest conversations than we ever had before. My dad, usually stoic and silent, admitted that he'd always been too soft on Jake, hoping that by not enforcing consequences, Jake would figure things out on his own. I thought he'd learn responsibility eventually, he said, sighing. But I should have stepped in earlier. I nodded, appreciating the honesty, but knowing it wouldn't erase years of neglect. My mom, too, showed a vulnerability I hadn't seen growing up. "We always thought you had it together," she said one afternoon as we sat in the living room, the awkwardness still there, but the tension slowly lifting. "Jake always needed more attention, and I guess we overlooked what you needed." It wasn't an apology, but it was something. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like they saw me for who I was, not just Jake's older brother, but someone who had fought hard for everything I had. Someone who had survived the betrayal and come out stronger. Jake, on the other hand, drifted away. Without the financial safety net from our parents and no stable job to lean on, he began to flounder. I heard from mutual friends that he was struggling, moving from job to job, unable to hold down anything long-term. There were rumors that he tried reaching out to some of our extended family for help, but even they had grown tired of bailing him out. Part of me felt a flicker of sympathy, but that was quickly replaced by a stronger sense of relief. Jake had always been shielded from consequences, but now he was finally facing them head-on. He had dug himself into this hole, and it wasn't my responsibility to pull him out. As for me, I focused on rebuilding. I started seeing a therapist to work through the emotional toll of the past few years, and it was eye-opening. I realized just how much I had suppressed, how many times I had buried my own feelings to keep the peace, to avoid being the difficult one in the family. But now, I was learning to stand up for myself in ways I hadn't before. Work became a safe haven, a place where I could put all my energy and focus on something that was mine. I started spending more time with friends, reconnecting with the parts of my life that had taken a back seat during the chaos. I even started dating again, cautiously opening myself up to the idea of love without the fear of betrayal lingering over my shoulder. With every passing day, I felt the weight of Jake's shadow lift. He was no longer this looming presence in my life, dictating my choices or affecting my self-worth. He was just gone, and I was finally free to live without constantly comparing myself to him, without the pressure of living up to someone else's expectations. Moving on wasn't easy, but it was worth it. I had shed the baggage of my past, and in its place was the realization that I deserved better. Better relationships, better respect, and most importantly, better peace. And that, more than anything, was what I had been searching for all along. Cutting ties with Jake felt like stepping into a new world, one where I could finally breathe. For the first time in years, my life wasn't tangled in the mess of my brother's actions. There were no more comparisons, no more feelings of inadequacy as the lesser sibling. Jake's betrayal had been the final blow, but in a strange way, it had also been a gift. It forced me to wake up, to realize that I was the only one responsible for my happiness. I threw myself into my work with a renewed sense of purpose. With all the emotional baggage finally shed, I felt more focused and driven than ever. I started taking on bigger projects, ones that challenged me and pushed me to grow. My hard work paid off quickly. Within a few months, I was promoted to a senior position, something I had always dreamed of but never thought I'd achieve. For the first time, my career felt like a reflection of my hard work and abilities, not something overshadowed by family drama. Outside of work, I began to rebuild friendships. Over the years, I had distanced myself from friends, mostly because dealing with Jake's chaos left me drained and exhausted. But now, I was reconnecting with people who truly cared about me, people who had stood by me during the hardest moments of my life. I realized just how much I had missed those simple moments of laughter, hanging out with friends who genuinely had my back. One night, over beers with my closest friend Mark, I finally allowed myself to talk about everything that had happened. "I can't believe how different my life feels now," I told him. "It's like I'm finally living for me." Mark nodded, leaning back in his chair. "It's about time, man. You've been carrying Jake's weight for too long. It's good to see you free of that." I smiled, feeling the weight of those words sink in. It was true. I was free. Free of the toxic cycle I had been stuck in for so long. free of the constant comparisons, the endless frustration of being the forgotten son. Jake's downfall had opened a door to a new life, one where I could finally be the main character in my own story. As the months passed, I started dating again. I was hesitant at first, still carrying the scars from what had happened with Emily, but I knew I couldn't let that define my future. I met someone new, Sarah, a woman who was warm, kind, and completely different from anyone I had been with before. She knew about my past, but she didn't judge me for it. Instead, she supported me as I continued to rebuild my life. We took things slow, which was exactly what I needed. For the first time, I wasn't rushing into anything, wasn't trying to prove myself or seek validation. I was dating on my terms in a way that felt right for me. With Sarah, I felt like I could be myself, no pretenses, no drama. Just real, honest connection. Every now and then, I'd hear whispers about Jake. Mutual friends would mention that he was still struggling, still bouncing from job to job, trying to find his footing. I didn't feel any joy in hearing about his downfall, but I also didn't feel responsible for him anymore. Jake was living the consequences of his choices, and it wasn't my job to fix that. My parents occasionally brought him up, but I kept the conversations brief. They had come to terms with their own mistakes in raising him. And while they tried to stay in contact with Jake, even they had realized that he needed to sort his life out on his own. Our relationship had improved significantly, but we had an unspoken agreement. Jake's name was rarely mentioned. Looking back, it was clear that Jake's betrayal had been a blessing in disguise. It had shattered the illusion that I had to keep holding on to the past, that I had to continue being the punching bag for my brother's ego. In cutting him off, I had reclaimed my life. Now I was living it on my terms. No longer weighed down by Jake's shadow, I was free to create the life I had always wanted. A life where I was in control, where I was surrounded by people who genuinely cared about me, and where my worth wasn't tied to anyone else's actions. Jake may have thought he was untouchable, but in the end, it was his arrogance that brought him down. As for me, I was finally moving on, and nothing was going to hold me back again.